Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our training. This is how to use the Zoom language interpretation function. I am your host, Jennifer Figuera, coordinator since 2015 and certified Spanish court interpreter. Let's begin. The objective of this presentation is to provide evidence-based, simple instructions and tips for judicial officers, court staff, and anyone who may host a Zoom meeting that requires a foreign language interpreter. As soon as the AOC provided me with a Zoom license, I began to host weekly practice meetings with interpreters, posed hypothetical scenarios, conducted role play, and engaged the interpretation function, listened to feedback, and compared our conclusions with instructions on the Zoom support webpage. There was a lot of trial and error. This presentation considers Title VI requirements and interpreters' ethical duties. The instructions we discuss here may change as we learn more or as Zoom upgrades its function. We could not test every possible scenario, but I do believe you will find this presentation and the reference guides coming soon helpful. These terms may be used differently by court staff and interpreters. Remote hearings can be via telephone or video. Please make sure to always tell the interpreter how you expect them to participate, in person in the courthouse, via telephone, or via video using Zoom or Skype. LEP stands for Limited English Proficient Individual. Zoom is a web-based video conferencing platform used during the COVID-19 pandemic in many courts without built-in VRI or video remote interpreting systems to hold remote hearings via video. Interpretation: a message is heard in one language, the source language, and then rendered orally in another language, the target language. During this presentation, you will not hear the word translation, as that refers to the written message. Courts seem to prefer Zoom for video hearings. Zoom has a function for simultaneous interpretation of foreign languages. The Zoom language interpretation function is not always necessary. The Zoom language interpretation function makes simultaneous interpretation possible for video hearings and meetings. It works as an alternate channel, allowing an interpreter to interpret out loud for one or more LEPs without disturbing the other participants or the recording. Without Zoom language interpretation, simultaneous interpretation can be achieved during a remote hearing by having an interpreter and litigant on a separate phone call. What Zoom cannot do. Human language services are required. Zoom will not translate, interpret, or add subtitles to a meeting. It cannot determine which language is being spoken or assign people to language channels for interpretation. What is simultaneous interpretation? Simultaneous is the mode recommended for interpretation of lengthy speeches in the language of the court in the U.S. English, such as witness testimony and judge's instructions, to save time, preserve the integrity of the record, and improve the language access quality. The interpreter hears the message in the source language and renders its meaning into the target language at the same time the speaker is speaking, with a slight delay referred to as décalage, whispering or speaking into specialized equipment as to not disrupt the proceeding. Question-answer exchanges with the LEP are interpreted in the consecutive mode. Simultaneous interpretation was used for the first time during the Nuremberg trials. Court interpretation until then was conducted exclusively in the consecutive mode, but witness testimony during the trials was so lengthy that interpreting them in the consecutive mode was exhausting and causing enormous delays in the proceedings. The court attorneys and interpreters gathered to determine if there was a more efficient way to interpret such extensive witness testimony. The Nuremberg trial interpreters were mostly multilingual Army members and international telephonic operators, many with communications and engineering backgrounds. They improvised equipment and connections, receivers, transmitters, and hundreds of feet of cable laid out throughout the floors of the courtrooms so that interpreters from separate sections or booths could hear the proceeding and at the same time interpret into multiple languages for the LEP participants. For video remote hearings that require a foreign language interpreter, the in-person setup can be recreated by adding a dedicated connection for the interpreter and LEP. In the United States, where English is the language of the court, simultaneous interpretation is rendered into the foreign language. The foreign language is not usually part of the record. The Zoom language interpretation function is only helpful if there will be long speeches in English during a video hearing. The interpretation function should not be activated at all if the hearing will consist primarily of questions to the LEP participant and his or her answers. In such cases, the interpreter and LEP will remain in the virtual hearing room with the judge and others on the call, and the interpreter will interpret in the consecutive mode. Audio logistics while the function is on. Mr. Doe is the LEP. Ann Smith is the interpreter. When the Zoom language interpretation function is activated, the LEP and interpreter are connected by selecting the same foreign language, while everyone else is tuned to English. This is explained later in Part 2 of the instructions. General information. The function is available with paid Zoom licenses. Setup is required in advance. Participants do not require a paid account. The host must enable the language interpretation function at the time of scheduling the meeting. The interpretation function cannot be initiated if using the Zoom mobile app. The interpretation function cannot be initiated during an unscheduled meeting. An interpreter must be hired and invited. LEP participants must download Zoom onto their devices. If they are using the Zoom mobile app, they can only listen to the language channel. Please remember that virtual hearings require a strong internet connection. Tip: please have an alternate device available, such as a cell phone. Now, step-by-step instructions. The following instructions are divided into 3 parts. 1. Initial setup at the account level settings. 2. Scheduling or creating the meeting. And 3. In the meeting. Once you obtain your Zoom license, sign into the Zoom web portal and click Settings. This may not be accessible from the settings from the Zoom shortcut on your desktop. Enable language interpretation under the In Meeting Advanced heading. Adding language names. Once enabled, the default 9 languages will display. Click the plus sign to add more languages. Type the name of the language you are adding. Click the language in the drop-down menu. Only languages on this list will later appear as options during your meeting. Some languages will appear with no data. I tested this, it doesn't matter. Click Add. I added Hindi and Other as a language. You cannot delete the 9 default languages, but can delete added languages from your account settings. Data found are colors associated to a language. It is clear to participants if the language that will be used during the hearing is added in advance, so it appears as an option later. Part 2 of the instructions, scheduling a meeting. The following are step-by-step instructions. Step 1. Open Zoom and log in. Note that the language interpretation function cannot be initiated when using the Zoom mobile app. Step 2. Schedule your meeting. Tip: if you schedule your meeting from your desktop shortcut, your buttons will look slightly different. For example, from the desktop, the button will say Schedule, while if you use the Zoom portal, it will say Schedule a meeting. Step 3. Enter your meeting information. Step 4. Find the Enable Language Interpretation box. For simultaneous interpretation to be possible during the meeting, the Enable Language Interpretation box must be checked at the time of scheduling the meeting. Step 5. Check the Enable Language Interpretation box. Step 6. Once you check the Enable Language Interpretation box, a new section will open. Step 7. If you already know who your interpreter will be, type your interpreter's email address in the box and select the language. He or she will receive a Zoom invitation. If not sure who the interpreter will be and an email is required to save your meeting, type in any email and select any language. This can be edited later, even during the meeting. Press Save to save the meeting. Tip: the interpreter must be a participant in the meeting. Therefore, an invitation must be forwarded to the interpreter as soon as he or she is confirmed for the assignment. The Court Interpreter program created reference guides on how to use the Zoom language interpretation function for host judicial officer, interpreters, and LEPs. Each time you schedule a Zoom hearing that requires an interpreter, provide everyone involved with instructions. Part 3 of the instructions, in the meeting. The following steps explain how to start and conduct a hearing for an LEP court user. If you are using your Zoom desktop shortcut, click on Meetings to view your scheduled meetings. Tip: if you need to add a microphone to your workstation, you can do it from here. Go to Settings, Audio, Speakers Microphone. Make sure the mic you are adding is on the list and select Test Mic. External microphones produce a better sound during the meeting than a computer mic. The following are step-by-step instructions on how to start your meeting. This section will explain only hearings for LEP court users where an interpreter is present. For general information on how to use Zoom and tips for optimal meeting results, please see the Zoom support page, which includes links to live training webinars and free recorded sessions. Step 2. Announce that an interpreter is present and ask the interpreter to identify him or herself, if able to ensure the litigant can hear and understand the interpreter. Ask everyone to speak clearly and only one at a time during the hearing. Administer the interpreter oath. Once the host turns on the language interpretation function, the interpreter will be able to interpret simultaneously for the LEP. Step 3. If it is anticipated that the hearing will include lengthy monologues or discussions in English, the host or judicial officer can activate the language interpretation function. At the bottom of the host's screen, select the interpretation button. A box will appear that prompts the host to enter the name of the interpreter and select the language if it was not pre-assigned. Step 4. Assign the interpreter. If not pre-assigned, assign the interpreter now. Enter his or her name in the long box. It will auto-populate. Select the language of the LEP and interpreter from the second box. Do not touch the first box that says English. Step 4. Continued. You can add or remove interpreters from this menu if necessary, or just assign one. When ready, click Start. Step 5. The interpreter accepts. After the host clicks Start, the interpreter will receive a message on his or her screen that says that he or she has been assigned as an interpreter, in other words, assigned a language channel. The interpreter must click OK. Step 6. The LEP must select the same foreign language. Tip: at the time of scheduling the remote hearing, provide LEP litigants with our Zoom reference guide for LEP court users, which explains that depending on the LEP's device, the language may be a globe or appear only if they click on the 3 dots. Step 7. The host must choose English from the interpretation window, and participants, except the interpreter and the LEP, must select English. Then the interpreter will be able to manage the language channel. Step 8. If language channels are set up as recommended, the interpreter can select English if he or she needs to be heard by participants in the hearing, for example, to interpret questions and answers from the LEP in the consecutive mode. The host can end the language interpretation function by selecting Interpretation, then clicking Stop. A refresher on audio logistics when the function is on and set up as recommended. Mr. Doe, the LEP, and Ann Smith, the interpreter, can hear each other. Participants can hear Mr. Doe, the LEP. Mr. Doe hears Ann Smith, the interpreter, at 80% volume and the meeting at 20%. Participants cannot hear the interpreter, this is deliberate, while she is interpreting in the simultaneous mode. Ann Smith, the interpreter, can enter the meeting by selecting English. We are approaching the end of our presentation. The following section is for troubleshooting. If a meeting is in progress and you require the interpretation function but it was not enabled in advance, you may ask participants to join the meeting in a few minutes, end the meeting, go to Zoom Upcoming Meetings, edit the meeting by enabling the language interpretation function, and then restart the meeting. If that does not work, you may need to schedule a new meeting. If during the meeting the language you need is not on the list, choose a similar language from the list and ask the interpreter and LEP to select that language. This can be avoided by adding the language at the time of scheduling the hearing. If you cannot hear the interpreter, he or she may be in the interpretation mode. The interpreter can hear the host or judicial officer and the other participants. If the language channel is not working, the host should disable it entirely and the interpreter will interpret in the consecutive mode. If the interpreter loses internet connection, he or she will attempt to reconnect for 2 minutes, then try to rejoin using a different device. If all else fails, the interpreter will dial in to the Zoom meeting. If the Zoom meeting ends abruptly, contact the interpreter right away with instructions. Interpreters can interpret via telephone in the consecutive mode if video and internet connectivity are unavailable. The host can stop and start the interpretation function as needed in the meeting, but participants will need to select their language every time. For additional training and support, please visit the Zoom Language Interpretation Support page. Here is the link. The second link is to Zoom's live training and videos page. We have now reached the end of the presentation. I appreciate your participation in how to use the Zoom language interpretation function. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. I am Jennifer Figuera, coordinator of the AOC Court Interpreter Program. If you have any questions regarding the Zoom interpretation function, wish to share feedback, or if your court is having difficulties in finding an interpreter for a hearing, please contact me via email at jennifer.figuera@delaware.gov or during COVID at 302-319-8348. If you would like to participate in a practice meeting with interpreters, feel free to contact me and I will set time aside to host a meeting for us. Thank you and be well.